My name is Charline Ann Pacey Chambers, and I was born in April the 24th, 1929 in Dayton, Ohio. That's kind of a special date because they said that Shakespeare was born on that day, not that year, and also Adolf Hitler. So I share my birthday with a few famous people in history. We moved to Corey Drive in Dayton View in possibly in the early part of 1931. As I said, I was born in 29 and I had older siblings. And my older brother, Junior, we called him Junior because he was named after my father. And he attended the Catholic school that was just around the corner from their house when we lived at the other place, that is on Anna Street where I was born. And he was not very well. He had gone to Sunday, first of all, he went to Sunday school with my mother. And so he didn't get to Mass that Sunday. And his teacher was a nun, and he went to school on a Monday, and she says, "Junior, where were you yesterday? You weren't at Mass." And he says, "Well, I went to Sunday school with my mother." And she said, "Okay, you stay after school and you will write penance. I will not attend Sunday school at the Protestant church." And so he came home from school late, and Mother said, "Why are you late?" And he told her what had happened. So when my father came home that evening, she told him what had happened to my little brother. And my father was a very good giver at that church. And he went over and spoke to the nun, and he said, "Don't you ever make my son write penance." So somehow that nun, I guess, had a little problem with our family. And when my brother became very ill, one day in school he wanted to go home, and she says, "No, you're not going to go home." Even though he could just walk around the corner to be to the house. But when he did get home, he was quite ill. And he ended up in the hospital with streptococcus. And in those days, they didn't have the drugs that we have now. And my little brother died. And I didn't, of course, I speak of him as my little brother, but really he was my older brother. And he was 7 years old, and I was just about a year old. And so Mother and Dad could no longer live in that neighborhood, and that's when they moved to Dayton View. And in 1931, my younger sister was born. And we lived in a lovely house. It was brand new, had beautiful plastered walls, and it was a brick house. And in those days, everybody heated their house with coal. And I remember my dad going every night, going down to the basement in the winter months and getting coal out of the coal bin and bringing it over and putting in the furnace. And then there was like a little pocket in the front of the furnace where he poured water into it. And I guess that was the old type of a humidifier in a way. And also the pipes of the furnace were very, very low. And in the wintertime when we couldn't play outside, we put on our skates, and we would skate around the furnace, but we'd have to duck to get under those ducts that went into the different parts of the house. And so anyway, we never liked to go down in the basement because of that old coal bin. And I understand when my parents first moved there that my father actually made wine in those stationary tubs because that was the time of Prohibition. This is something my older sister told me. She remembered, but I was too young to understand that. And so my father was very apt in working in the garden. He raised tomatoes, which were fabulous, and beautiful American, what was it called? American rose. But they were climbing roses that he had a lattice that went up the side of the garage, and he had beautiful roses. And many times in the summertime he would cut some of those roses and we would take them to the cemetery and put on my brother's grave. And anyway, one of my jobs as a little girl was to polish all the white shoes. I would polish my dad's shoes and I polished my mother's shoes, and I guess that's why I still like to polish shoes, although these two need to be polished. I'm trying to think of some of the things that happened in my life when I was little. And, but I will mention one thing that happened to my older sister, Angela. She went to school, I think she was about in the 2nd grade, and she came home one day with her glasses were all like this and broken, her face was red and scratched, the collar of her coat had been ripped, and Mother said, "What happened to you?" And she said, there were some boys that beat up on me, Mommy, and they said we don't want Dagos living in our neighborhood. And we had Jewish people that lived in our neighborhood. We had people of all faiths, but we were the only Italian family, so to speak, Italian. My mother wasn't Italian, but my dad was full-blooded Italian. And so we had problems with these boys. But my dad worked he left for work early in the morning and he came home after the evening meal, and he didn't have a chance that he could connect with the father of these boys. But anyway, he knew he had to teach us girls how to protect ourselves. And so he went to a sporting goods and he bought a great big punching bag and hung it in the basement. I haven't told very many people about this because they probably would think this was a terrible thing to do. But anyway, he taught my sister Angela how to fight. And of course, I would sit on the steps and watch this. And also, my dad used to take us to prize fights there in Dayton. Here was Mr. Pacey with his 4 little girls watching the guys fighting up there in the... So that was one of the crazy things, I guess, that I remember from my childhood. And there were 2 times I played hooky from school. I think it was about in the 1st grade and when I was a senior in high school. And we were not allowed to get in the snow and take our hats off and all that kind of stuff. Our teacher was very fussy because we had to come into the building and take our boots and our snow pants and all that kind of stuff off, and then put it in the room where you hung your things. Well, anyway, one of my friends and I don't know if we got in a fight or what, but I was chasing her and throwing snowballs at her, and I had snow all over me. And when I went into the schoolroom, and my teacher was very upset with me. Her name was Mrs. Mann. And she said, "Charline, you just get out of here and go in there in the other room and get the snow off your clothes." I went in that room and I started to take off my coat, and I thought, I don't have to be here in this school. I don't have to take that from her. So I went out the door and down the hall, and I went home. And I came home, and my mother was vacuuming. I remember she was vacuuming the living room, and my little sister Mary was with her. And she said, "Charlie, what are you doing here?" And I said, "I got mad at that teacher. I don't want to go to that school anymore." And I don't know if she called the principal or the principal called her. But anyway, they said that I had to go back to school. And I says, "No, Mother, I don't want to go back. I don't feel very good. Please don't make me go back." She said, "Charline, you have to go back." And the teacher had sent my best friend to the house, and they thought that maybe I would go back if I didn't have to go alone. And so I can't even remember what her name is now. But then we went back to the school and going down the hall, and I saw the principal. If there was any woman in the world that was a witch, that principal was a witch. Her name was Miss Maud Rupel. And she was kind of big in through here, and she always wore a special dress that made her look very dignified. And she had a whistle, and she would blow the whistle in the hallway, and everybody, you just felt like you were in a prison. But anyway, I saw her coming down the hall, and I said to my friend, I said, "There's Miss Rubel. If she sees me, what's she going to do?" And she said, "We got to get to the class." And we tried to get behind the door, but she saw us. She came up to me, and she looked down at me, and she says, "Charline Pacey, don't you ever do anything like that again. Don't you ever leave the school." From that moment, I hated her, and I hated school. And to this day, I'll never forget that incident. But the teacher, I think, after that realized that maybe she was too hard on me. During that school year, I got the scarlet fever. I missed 6 weeks of school. And I believe someone is at my door right now. I don't think I can talk with you for a while.
We'll take a break and we'll come back. Thanks, Grandma.
Okay, I was just curious. When you were a little girl, what was your favorite thing to do? What did
When
you
I
like?
was
When you were a little girl, what was your favorite thing to do as a little girl? What did you like to play?
Well, I wanted to dance, and I wanted to be a singer. And I was taking piano lessons and voice lessons, and I said, "Oh, Mother, can I take dancing lessons?" "Well, you can't take everything, Charline." And I said, "Oh, I just love to dance." You know, I go in the living room and I go round and round, on, like I'd see in the movies. You know, and we went to the picture show. We called it the picture show in those days, every Saturday and sometimes Sunday night too. And I loved Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy and Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. They were the dancers. And you know, I guess that nowadays children have their idols in the movies, and we did too in those days. Mm-hmm. They lived in our, of course, it was imagination. But I always thought someday I would be a performer, until I came to a service at Mother and Daughter Banquet, and I heard a missionary speak. And that's when I changed my mind. I wanted to be a missionary. And that was after my father died, of course, so he didn't know that I had that change, because he encouraged me. He felt as though I had the gift that I could become a performer. But I rather would serve the Lord and use the gifts that he gave me for his glory rather than for myself. But as a little girl, I guess I just loved to pretend and be an actress and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And we loved to play restaurant. Didn't we play restaurant when you children were little? Mm-hmm. And we'd set up a table, and one would be a waitress and one would be the customer, and we'd play in the living room because we didn't have any special place to play in our house. And I was always embarrassed. It seemed like our house was always a mess. We were always climbing over toys and shoes and stuff. But anyway, it was Mother did the best she could to keep it picked up.
Mm-hmm. Another question I always want to know is, what was it like when you first met Dad? You got fixed up like as a blind date, or what?
Yes, it was a blind date. I had gone on a mission trip to British Columbia and Alaska. I never got to Alaska, but his brother-in-law was representing Bible Institute of Los Angeles, which Dad was a graduate of that school, and I was coming from Bob Jones University. We had students from Taylor and King's College and Moody Bible Institute and Wheaton. And but anyway, his brother-in-law wrote a letter back to him, to Dad, and said, "I think you ought to look this girl up." So I got this letter from Everett Chambers, and he told me a little bit about himself. As a matter of fact, I still have that letter. And he asked if he could come down and have dinner with me. Well, I didn't want to act too anxious, so I think I waited a week or two before I even answered the letter. And I said yes, and he picked out a Saturday. And I remember I had a nice suit on and got my hair fixed as best I could. And I was thinking about him, and I said, "Everett Chambers, Reverend Everett Chambers," because he was studying to be the minister. "Mrs. Chambers, Mrs. Everett Chambers, Charline Chambers. That sounds kind of nice." And he was driving down in his little old fluid Plymouth car, and he was thinking, Charline Pacey, Mrs. Charline Chambers. Charline Chambers, that sounds kind of nice. And so, of course, I had a little brother, 10 years old, and the doorbell rang, and he went to the door, and Everett was there, and he says, is this where Charline Chambers lives? And he says, yes, and he slammed the door in his face.
Oh my gosh.
And I was mortified, just mortified. And I went to the door, and I thought, what will this fellow think? I opened the door, and here stands this living doll. He was so handsome.
Oh, man.
Beautiful wavy hair. As a matter of fact, I have a picture in the other room of what he looked like after we were married 5 years, and he was still handsome then. But he had the beautiful wavy hair and a little bit of gray on both sides, which he was very conscious of, and a big smile. And he had a gold piece on the one side of his mouth, and my father had one in the same place. And I invited him in, and I couldn't get out of that house fast enough. We went to a restaurant, and I remember that the night before I got the newspaper out and I checked the sports, I checked current events and all these. I thought, I don't know what he's interested in, and I hope that I can be up to date in whatever he talks about. So we went to this restaurant, and also I had gotten my etiquette book out too, because I'd never been invited out for a meal like that. And it said that the gentleman is supposed to suggest what he would like, and would you like that? And he didn't. And he says, whatever you would like, Charline. I thought, oh my goodness, how much can he afford if he's just a ministerial student? So I picked a medium size, and it was a vegetable dish, I think. And that looks good. And then, of course, he had to have his chocolate sundae. And I thought, he likes ice cream. And I don't know what we talked about, but we visited the Art Institute, and he was picking up things and looking at things, and I thought, well, he's very inquisitive. And he pulled out his handkerchief, and I noticed that wasn't very clean. And then he had to go to the restroom, and also the car was so old that he didn't have good brakes on it. So when we stopped, he had put a big rock behind the tire. And then also I sat there and waited for him to open the door, and he couldn't open the door from the outside. He had to open the back door again. Or somehow I kind of helped him get the door open. It was quite an eventful date, I would say. When we came home, Aunt Vera, my sister, was painting the front porch, and she was very unfriendly. She says, well, you're going to have to go around the back. And so we went around the back and came on in the house, had to come through the kitchen, but everything was pretty much in order. Went into the living room, and he sat in a chair, and my brother went over to the chair, and he kept pushing on the back of it, And, my family was so unfriendly. My mother was very nice to him. But anyway, it got to the time where he thought he better be going. He had to drive 80 miles to get back to Galena.
Wow.
And he was so gracious and so nice to me. And he pulled away, and I almost went into tears. I says, he'll never come back. He'll never come back with my family the way it is. And he was back in 2 weeks, and every other week we would have a Saturday night date. We went to Youth for Christ meetings, and those were interdenominational gatherings where young people who were believers attended these meetings, and they usually had outstanding Christian leaders, speakers. I don't think we ever had Billy Graham, but we had Bob Jones Jr., I remember once. And I would sing solos at those. And they printed in the paper. My name was in the paper, and they had flyers, and my name was Charline Chambers, soloist, Charline Pacey. And that's where I began to sing at more events besides my own church. I was asked to sing at conferences and at funerals and weddings. And I had started my voice lessons when I was about 8 years old. And but you, as far as your dad is concerned, we went to Youth for Christ meetings, and that's when I discovered that he had a beautiful baritone voice. And I thought, we both like music, we both love the Lord. What's going to happen here? And I was dating a pre-med fellow too, the odd Sundays.
Oh my
So,
gosh, so every other weekend.
Every other weekend. It was the preacher one weekend and the med student the other. But the med student stood me up one night. And then later on he called me and he said, he says, were you waiting for me Thursday night? And I crossed my fingers. I said, because I was lying, I said, no, I wasn't waiting for you. But that was it. I thought, I'll never date that fella again. So.
Well, I've got one more question I want to ask you. What was it like when when World War II occurred? Like, how did that impact you? What were you thinking when you guys were going through that?
Well, it was frightening because in our city was the Wright-Patterson Field, well, of course, we didn't have the Air Force then. Really, the pilots, or whatever you would call them, those who served in, which later was called the Air Force, were really a part of the Army. Mm-hmm. After the Second World War, the Air Force became another branch of the military. But anyway, many of the bombers left from that field, and also the Pursuit, the plane that more or less led the bombers to where they were going to go in Germany and also in North Africa and the different places where the war was taking place. I think I was concerned greatly about it because my stepfather was in the military. And then we came to the place, I remember at one time, where we did not know where he was. And that was scary, it really was. And my mother never let us read any of his letters. And there was something about the Second World War when soldiers or sailors wrote home. All of their letters were censored, and some of their lines were actually darked out, some things that they said that the enemy could get that letter. Oh. And all of their letters were free. You know, on the corner, instead of a stamp, it was written free, and you knew that was the military. And of course, when Grandpa came home, there were certain things he couldn't talk about. And I was concerned, too, because there were so many in the school who, other students that weren't the least bit concerned about it, you know. And they sold war stamps, and every Monday I went to a certain place and I got my war stamp, and in time I had enough stamps that I got a war bond. And I got that with my babysitting money. And it troubled me that other students weren't concerned about it, because I guess they didn't have anyone in their own family who was in the conflict that was going on. And we wondered about the future, and we had food stamps. There were every family got so many stamps from the members of their family. There were just so much you could meat that you get. There were some foods you couldn't have at all. And actually, Grandpa would bring us chewing gum and Hershey bars from the what's it called? There's a certain store that just the soldiers had on the base, and they could get those things for themselves, and they would take them to their families. And we had our air raid drills, and those were kind of scary too, because you couldn't have any lights on, a flashlight or a cigarette light or anything.
So what was it like? Like this loud alarm would go off?
Yes, an alarm, just like here, you know, at 12 o'clock this alarm goes off, and it was like that. And it was all over the city of Dayton. In other words, Dayton was a place that could have been bombed because of the Air Force, out there at Wright-Patterson.
So you were told when that alarm went off to turn all your lights out?
You had to turn all your lights
off?
off.
What else did you have to do?
Yeah, we had to turn all the lights in the house off. And it was in the summertime. Remember, we sat on the porch and we looked out and watched the wardens that were out there with their metal hats and their flashlights, and it was just for so long. And then at a certain time, the alarm would would go off, and then it was over. But it was a good testing, and people cooperated with that, which was good. But you know, there was still that anxiousness that you felt. Every night, everybody turned on their radio at 6 o'clock for the 6 o'clock news. Lowell Thomas was the newsman. Of course, we got our local news, and then we got the Associated Press. And also in our newspaper on the front page, it always, periodically, it had a picture of Europe. And they called the Nazi or the German army was like the Axis. They called it the Axis. And you could see as they would progress and take over a country, that got bigger. That black got bigger. In other words, their nation became bigger. They took over Poland and I can't remember some of the countries that were very definitely, was it Czechoslovakia? But I know there were different countries, because, you know, I was only a teenager. And the countries there and in Africa have new names now. And some of them are larger and some of them are smaller, which were taken by the Russians, of course. And so it was, that was another scary thing. We went to the picture show, or the movie, as we called it, and we had the Pathé News, and you would actually see the conflict. You would see the Germans marching, and the cannons, and the planes dropping the bombs, and I mean, you felt like you're right there with it, and it was frightening. It really was. But we survived, and as Americans, we worked together. It didn't make any difference if you were black or white. It didn't make any difference what religion you were or your background, rich or poor. We worked together for our country, and that's how we won that war. And right now, when I see how our people are fighting against each other as Americans, it breaks my heart, because our country is great because of what we do together, how as neighbors we care for each other. And we know that the teachings of Christ is that we are to love our neighbor, pray for those that persecute you or hurt you, and that we are the light of Christ here in this world. We are his ambassadors. We are his hands, his feet, his tongue. And it's our responsibility to proclaim that message that he gave us, that we have within our hearts. And that's what I feel is the most important thing in my life. If I can pass this on to my children and my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh upon the Father except through him. And that's what keeps me going, because I have many hours that I'm alone. There's no one sitting across the table from me that I can talk with. And throughout the day, I talk to my Heavenly Father and pray, and whatever I do. And I say, Father, thank you so much for doing this for me. Or, you know, I can't find something, and I'm praying, oh, help me find it. And I finally find it. Oh, Father, there it was all the time. Thank you for leading me to it. And I just talk with him as though he's here, not in body, but his spirit. And so I'm grateful for his watch care over me, and that through him I came to know the most wonderful man in the world, Everett.
Thanks, Mother.
And God bless us with 4 wonderful Christian young people, children. And I know it was hard being preachers' kids. And I'm sure they did things that they never told us. But they never shamed us. I think they respected so much their dad's position that they tried in every way to do the right thing. And each one of them loves the Lord, and I know is serving him with the gifts that he has given them. And you, Kathy, I'm so proud of what you are doing for him.
Thanks. My memory of when Martin Luther King died, we were at Dayton at Grandma Main's house, and I remember you guys talking about this. You were really upset, and we didn't know who Martin Luther King was because we were real little. But I do remember then I think we drove home, or no, we rode a train home to Walworth. Do you remember this?
Yes.
What happened then?
Well, we got the train in.
Was it in Dayton?
We got it in Dayton, and we drove. We rode on the train to Chicago, and Dad wasn't with me. It seems to me, I can't remember. I had the children with me. Even Tim was then. But I can remember that there was rioting that started in Chicago as a result of it. And we could look out the windows and look back at Chicago, and we could actually see the smoke coming up from the fires. And it was a frightening experience. Martin Luther King was a man that was very brave. And, you know, his dream was that all little boys and girls could play together, and that there wouldn't be any difference, you know. And that was his dream. And he made a beautiful message or a sermon, and in the mall, I guess it's called, in Washington, where there were so many people, and you could look across the water, and I think that was where the Washington Monument was. And that's when he had that very famous message that many black young people have memorized, and they quoted, they recited on his birthday. He was born the same year as I. He was born in January of 1929, and I was born in April.
So he would be 90 this year.
Yes, he was born in, and a lot of the schools closed. I know I don't think the post office is even open on Martin Luther King's birthday. But he left his mark very definitely, and he was American Baptist.
Oh, yeah. Another question.
And I have a personal autograph.
How did you get an autograph from him?
Dad got it at an American Baptist convention. He spoke at one of the conventions. I think it was in Philadelphia. We saw Dick Powell, the movie star, there too.
So Dad got to hear him speak?
Yeah, I got to hear him too. He spoke at the convention, and somehow Dad went to one of the side meetings where he was, and he had his program, and he asked him if he could sign his name on it. And that is in our safety deposit box.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So here's another question. Where were you when Pearl Harbor was, bombed, and how were you feeling, and how did you experience that?
That was at night, and we were getting out of church. And I can't remember how we got home, because of course, when was that? What was that? What year was that? 41? 41, what happened? And of course, my father was gone, so Mother began to go to church more with us and take us to church. But in those days, when there was the news that came out like that, the newspaper right away printed an edition, and the newsboys went through the neighborhood. Extra, read all about it. Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor.
Oh my gosh.
Well, naturally, nobody knew where Pearl Harbor was unless you had military that were stationed there. But it was on the Pathé News when we went to the movies, and it showed the the Arizona ship that was, I think that was the one that went down. And of course, there were families that lived there. There were several of our large Navy vessels that were affected by it. And some of the missionaries that were stationed in that area actually told our military the Japanese are preparing for something, but they wouldn't listen. Because I read this in a book that a missionary had written, and they said we went to the military and we told them the Japanese are doing something. And sure enough, it was a surprise, and it was frightening. And at that time, it was amazing how many young men actually went and joined the Army. They wanted to get into it, Wow. And we were already involved in Europe and with the Germans, and it was, you thought, what's going to happen next? But somehow we got through it. And of course, your grandfather, Grandpa Maine, spent a good time in Japan in the Army of Occupation, and he was invited to Japanese homes and they entertained him. They treated him so nicely. And he went to the public baths and took his bath with the other men, the public men, and he heard quite a commotion, and all the women on the women's side found out that there was an American soldier who was white, who was in there with the Japanese, and they all wanted to see him. And the Japanese people are smaller, much smaller than the Americans. You know, they're in stature and all. Very, very courteous, very gracious. And because I have a dear friend now who is a retired missionary, she spent 40 years in Japan and went after the war. And when the war was declared, you know, the surrender took place, MacArthur said, send missionaries to Japan. And so many denominations sent missionaries to Japan to reach those people for Christ. And Grandpa Maine came back and got acquainted with this Japanese man, and they became partners, and that's how they built together the Dorothy Lane Market. Mr. Sakata and his family, of course, even though they were Americans, they were Japanese Americans, and they were put in those, you know, those camps. And there were professionals, there were doctors and lawyers, educated Japanese Americans that were in those places, and they were treated almost like prisoners. But President Roosevelt gave that order that they had to all leave their homes and be put in that place until
So
the end.
he came back and they were friends and they decided
But
together?
he met him after he came back to the States.
Oh, okay.
Mr. Sakata and his wife were working for some very wealthy people in Oakwood. And I don't know how Grandpa Maine got acquainted with him, but he could see that Mr. Sakata had the ambition to do something better. I think he maybe was a yardman or whatever. Uncle Norman could probably tell you the exact background on how they met. But together they started the Dorothy Lane Market, just a little market outside market on the corner of Dorothy Lane and Far Hills. And I can remember also when the new store was built, and I think I was in college at that time. I worked at Dorothy Lane Market one day, but that's when it was the little market. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't remember the prices. Aunt Mary would get real aggravated with me because I couldn't remember how much the loaf of bread and the milk, because nothing was marked.
Oh, you had to just remember.
And you had just a regular cash register. And I was scared to death. And then there were young men that would come in and buy a pack of cigarettes. And I thought that was terrible. And I thought I was contributing to something that wasn't good. And I went home that night and I told Mother, I says, I can't work there. So I spent the rest of the summer babysitting.
So when you were a young girl, what was your first job? What did you do? Like your first job you ever had?
My first job. Well, of course, I learned how to be a clerk by working on the market stand when I was a little girl. And I was in charge of the lemons. 4 lemons for a dime.
Oh my God.
That was what my dad assigned to me. And that was, you know, I had to be gracious to the customers and put their lemons in the sack and hand it to them. And they gave me the dime, and I said, thank you. And then there was a little drawer you pulled out, and it had the little sections you put the dime in. That was really my first job, I would say.
Your first job, you were 10.
Yeah, I must have been, well, no, I wasn't even 10 because I must have been about 8 years old because I was 9 years old when my dad died. He died in '39, and I didn't turn 10 until April. But then, let me see, I did a lot of babysitting, and then it was before I went to college, I guess it was. I worked in the lingerie department of Elder and Johnson department store, and that was interesting too. I learned how to display a slip or a pair of panties or a nightgown and describe it and how well it was made, and knew how to measure it on a lady's a slip, you know, how to do that sort of thing. And I bought most of my lingerie for my trousseau do that department, and then that's when Dad and I got married. Also, I worked for a year for the Child Evangelism Fellowship.
What'd you do in that job?
I was a director of it for Montgomery County, and I taught the teachers. And some of the teachers were older than I were, and they were great teachers, but I had to teach child evangelism material. And that's when all of the stories were usually told with a flannel graph, which was, I love to do that. I actually carried flannel graph into my teaching when I started in the public schools, of using little felt objects like for Valentine's Day, I had them counting little red hearts, and the children would come up and put them on the flannel board. One of the good ways in teaching is get the child involved. Likewise, using all the senses you can think of when you're teaching, they can learn by what they see, what they hear, what they touch, what they taste, and they will learn about some concept by using all of those different senses. What was the question again?
What your first job was?
Yeah, and that was the first where I made $22 a week, I think, at the it was child evangelism. I can't remember what I made working at Elders though. And I was working at 2 jobs really, at both of them. But I got kind of concerned later in life, the system of child evangelism where they use the wordless book. And the wordless book the cover is green, and you open the first page and it's black. And you tell the child, your heart is black with sin. And then you go to the red, but the blood of Jesus Christ will blot out that sin, and then your heart is white. And you use the white page, and then you close the book, and there's green. The green represents growing in Christ. But as I got older, and when we came to the days of where the black people began to rebel against the way, they had their marches and all that sort of thing, the children were taught then that black is beautiful. And so that bothered me. That bothered me. And so this was when we were in Kokomo, I believe, that we had a child evangelism worker who came in to help with Vacation Bible School, and she wanted to use the wordless book. And so I said, well, I used to work in child evangelism, and I said, at that time, I went along with it, but I said, I don't like that black page. I said, and right away she caught her breath and she got really excited. And she says, but the scripture says that the heart is deceitful. I said, yes, it does, but it doesn't say that it's black.
So that was just
the heart is deceitful, but it does not say it's black.
Yeah.
I don't think you see many colors in God's word. And so our other Sunday school teachers heard me say that. But I think we have to be careful of the things that, especially when we're teaching a child, because they don't understand symbolism. They really believe there's in my heart there's a light in there because Jesus is in there, But you have to remember the age of the child and what he can understand, and be very, very careful in some of the things that you are saying that she'll get a little confused.
How would you explain to a young child how to believe,
Somebody's getting in the cookie jar.
how to believe in Jesus without saying, do you want Jesus in your heart? Because as a young child, they take that literally. So how would you explain it to a young child without saying that?
Let me see, how would I say that? Because right now I'm working with this little 5-year-older. And I think you talk about the love of Jesus, how much Jesus loves us. And we know that all of us are sinful. We do naughty things, even we grown-ups. We may tell a lie, or we may think a bad thought, or we may say something unkind to someone, or we may disobey our parents. And it's because there's sin in us. It's just the way we're made. But I said when we if we turn those sins over to Jesus and tell him that we're sorry for those sins and that we ask him to come into our lives, into our heart. Yeah, into our lives. And maybe I do use the heart. I don't know. It's been so long since I've really directed that type of a invitation even. But first of all, the child has to admit that he is a sinner, and that Jesus died for those sins. And of course, God cannot look upon sin because he is righteous. That's why he had to turn away from the Lord when he was on the cross. And Jesus said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Because God was no longer there to protect him, and he was on his own. And that's when he was bearing the sins of the world. But it's very difficult, I think, to really help a child to understand that. But I guess maybe you could say, let him come into my life. And as he matures in his understanding of, and you have to keep teaching. Mm-hmm. It just isn't once in a while. A child has to learn in life that this is something you can pray about. You're going to have a test tomorrow. Okay, just ask Jesus to help you to remember what you studied, and that you can be calm, cool, and collected. My hands used to get so clammy. I would be so scared and so frightened. And as I mentioned to Dan and my grandson Aaron last night, I missed 6 weeks of school because of scarlet fever. When I went back to school, the other children were reading, and I wasn't. And I couldn't keep up with them. And I was always in the lowest reading group. They had the red birds, the cardinals, the what, and the robins, and I was always in the lowest one, which was probably the blackbirds. I don't know. And I was very self-conscious about that, and it affected me all through school. I never liked to read. Even to this day, I don't like to read out loud to adults.
But somehow you figured out a way to be very successful in your life because you went to college and continued on and got several degrees and have done some very challenging, difficult things in your life. Mm-hmm. So in spite of feeling like you didn't get the best education because you were out for 6 weeks, mm-hmm. you kind of came back and were very successful in spite of that, right?
Yeah, I try to adjust to it. But even in college, in the American literature class where we have these great big books that we're reading, literature, something that goes back to the early readings or writings of the English American literature. I was sitting there and we had to read the rows. And I was watching those ahead of me, and I was figuring out, where am I going to have to read? Mm-hmm. Because I was terrified that there'd be a word there that I wouldn't know or I couldn't pronounce. To this day, I still have that problem. But
you still did pass.
But I managed. And I did tell my Bible study group about this. I said, for me to read in public is one of the most difficult things for me, because I said right away, my hands begin to clam and my heart just beats real fast.
So you've done a lot of things outside your comfort zone, a lot.
Well,
gotten up in front of people, sang in front of people, led groups, led Bible studies, and done some things that a lot of people really couldn't do or didn't feel comfortable. You really have put yourself out of your comfort zone in many situations, right?
It hasn't been, and I have to be careful too, as a pastor's wife, and because of those degrees I have to be careful of how I present it, so that I won't make someone who hasn't had those privileges feel inadequate. And sometimes some pastors' wives can be a little more bossy, or a little more, I know a little bit more than you do, or whatever. And I have an office in my circle where I just charge the love gift, a special offering that we take for our missionaries. And I try to have something that all of us can relate to, that even though our circle is very small, we have met together for 50 years.
Oh my God.
We're senior citizens now.
That's a long time.
And we are not able to get the younger women in our churches involved in our mission work because many of them have gone to the bigger churches where there are more interesting activities and opportunities for them as well as for their children. And so I just say, you know, we're a little circle, but I says, over there's another circle, and over here's a women's society. And I says, if all of us give our little bit, then it's a lot, you know. And our missionaries benefit from them. And my love gift is very special to me. And as I say, I talk to the Lord during the day. And I come home from something, maybe from the grocery store or from somewhere that something wonderful has happened. I go right to my love gift box and I put money in it. And, you know, in a month, you can collect quite a bit in that little box. And of course, we had our Girls Guild in the American Baptist, and we started one at Brick Church, and you girls were in it. Here come these little boys.
Hey guys. Baby, pretty with us.
Okay, tell me about when you and Dad were dating. How did he propose to you?
In a very interesting way. He wrote me a 10-page letter several days before that on the phone that he was taking some friends from Kentucky that were visiting with him to a TV program in Columbus. And while I am reading the letter, I turn on the TV and I see him in the audience. I can see his glasses reflecting in the lights. And I could see the people that he brought, but he had no idea that I could see him while I was reading that letter. And in the letter, he said, I would like for you to be my wife. He says, I don't have much to offer because he was still a student in Otterbein College. And naturally, he still lived at home and just had a little preaching job. He didn't have much of an income. But he would, in that fall year, he would be going to Kentucky as a missionary and teaching in a school. And I think I went to his graduation, and after the graduation we had that evening together and we were driving along and he says, you got my letter? And I said, yes, I got your letter. It was real casual. And he says, what did you think of it? And I said, oh, it was a very nice letter. And I saw you on television when I was reading it. And I know he was just getting so eager. Is she going to marry me or not? And finally he said, well, what else? He says, but I just can't remember what he said, but I said, yes, the answer is yes. I'll be glad to be your wife.
Did you kiss after that?
No, we were driving along on, and interesting enough, it was a road not too far from his house where all the couples they called it the road that a lot of lovers went, but Lover's Lane. Lover's Lane, yes, it was Lover's Lane. And the wedding was at 3:30. I think it was at 3:30, December the 27th, Saturday afternoon. And Aunt Vera was my maid of honor. Aunt Elsie, that was his sister, was one of the bridesmaids, and one of my friends from college, and one of the girls from my church. I really wanted Aunt Angela to be my maid of honor, and Aunt Vera to be my one of my attendants. But Aunt Angela was just a newly converted Catholic, and she could not participate in the service. And so she served at my reception, and Aunt Mary sang at our wedding. Uncle Wesley was one of the groomsmen. Uncle Eldon was the best man. Our neighbor, no, it wasn't. No, it was two friends of Dad's that were good friends of Dad's that were the other groomsmen that he'd grown up with, I think. He went to Buffalo first, and that's where the wind blew and his hat flew off. And that's the first time I ever saw him lose his temper, because he had to chase that down, you know, and he was embarrassed besides. We went to Niagara Falls, I think, the second day, and then we ended up in Detroit on New Year's Eve. after we had finished our breakfast, they came and put finger bowls at the table. And Dad looked at the finger bowls, and he looked at me and says, "What are we supposed to do?"
And did you know what to do?
I said, "Well, let's just dip our fingers." I said, "We dip our fingers in the water. Then we take our napkin and we dry our hand." And I said, "Then they'll come and take that dish away."
So you knew about that.
And they did. I don't know how I remembered that, because I think that they did that on the, on the trains those years. They had the diners, and they had the black waiters with the white coats, and they would wait on you, and after you had something, your dinner, then they would bring the finger bowls. And I think maybe I went someplace with my mother or whatever, but I think that's how I knew what to do. Then we drove back to Dayton, and we headed down to Kentucky. And when we got to a certain place, we had to trade all that, or move all that stuff into this little old car on the mountain roads. And in many areas, we actually had to drive through the creek. There was no road. We had to drive through the creek. And so he had the ironing board and all the gifts and things and whatever behind me. And every time he'd stop real quick, that ironing board would come in the head. I can remember that. It wasn't too bad, but I do remember that happening. Up this little drive that was a hill up to they called it the manse, which is the parsonage. And he carried me over this threshold. And that was our first home together. We did not have running water. We pumped our water and carried it up, and we heated it on a kerosene stove. And we just had a tub bath once a week. A lot of lifting and carrying of things. But, when you're young and you're in love, you don't mind. It doesn't make any difference.
So what was it like giving birth in the 50s?
In the 50s?
Yeah.
And to be up in the mountains of Kentucky?
There's a lot of difference in medical technology compared to now.
Oh, yes.
And being out in a rural area, what was that like?
When Mary Dawn was due, they thought someplace in the late 20s of August. So I waited, and she didn't come, and it got to be September. September 1, September 2, and so I finally said to the doctor, "When is this baby going to come?" And he says, "Well, it's like an apple in a tree. It won't fall until it's ready." And so I went in on a Monday, and I was staying in a home, and I had a room, and I was running out of money, too, because I had to pay so much. They gave me my breakfast, and then I had to pay to be there, and then I had to find a restaurant to eat.
Did you have anyone with you?
No, and I had to walk. I had to walk to a restaurant. They started the process of giving me injections. And I was in a room with a lady who was not ready. They were giving her injections to stop her from having labor and giving them to me to start it. So she says, "I hope and pray they don't get those injections next up." So I would lie there in that bed. There was nothing to read, there was nothing to do, and I would lie there on the bed, and I looked up at the wall, at the ceiling, and it had blocks. And each block had so many dots in it. I counted the blocks, and I counted the bumps, and I got so bored, and I prayed, and I thought, will this baby ever come? Nothing happened. Nothing happened.
Pain or anything?
Nothing at all. And I don't know how long they had me there, and then finally, when the little pains began to start, they put me in another room, and they were getting kind of bad. And Grandpa came in, and I was kind of groaning, and he said, "Shh, shh, shh." He told me to be quiet. And so the nurse says, "Well, it's time to do some checking. Mr. Chambers, will you please step out?" After he got out the door, I says, "Don't let him back in here." I said, "He doesn't know what's going on." And I said, my maternal grandfather told me, if it makes you feel better to groan, groan. So I was groaning, but I've been in the hospital 4 different times for babies, and I've heard more than groans out of some women. They really scream and carry on. But It was pretty rough, and they finally got me into the labor room. He said, breathe in, and the doctor says, push. Okay, have you ever tried to push and breathe in at the same time? And the doctor got aggravated with me. Mrs. Chambers, I told you to push, and, you know, I don't already feel so bad. You have to scold me too. But anyway, they finally put me out, and I did not know when Mary Dawn came, but she was very tiny. Things seemed to be a little different when Tim came, because that was, let's see, how much younger is Tim? You know the story, he's the afterthought. Yeah, he's the, because with the 3 girls, we said, that's it, no more. But my mother-in-law said, oh, Charlene, you're not going to stop until you have a boy. We've got to carry the name on. And I thought, well, wonder if I have another girl. And so Everett and I had an afterthought. We had to think about this and talk about it. And so, okay, let's try. And we decided on the name, but we didn't know. I thought if it was a girl, I was going to call her Vera Joy. And all the cousins and whatever had picked, they'd had Matthew, they had Mark, they had Daniel, they had David. And I thought, what are we going to, if we have a little boy, what are we going to call him? And we kept looking at the names in the Bible, and I said, oh, Everett. He wanted to call the baby Everett. And I said, that's such a blunt name, Everett. I always called my husband Honey anyway. So I said, how about Timothy Everett? Doesn't that sound nice? I said, isn't that Timothy? It's kind of like a melody. Timothy. Timothy Everett. And he said, yes, that would be fine. And so it was exciting. And when it was time for Tim to be delivered, the doctor said, I think I said to the nurses, I've had 3 little girls, and I said, we're hoping so much that this is a boy. And when I found out that it was a boy, the doctor was as excited as I was. Really says, it's a boy, Mrs. Chambers. And I said, oh, thank you, Lord. And he was a wonderful doctor. He was a Christian doctor. And so we got our little boy.
And what are the age differences?
Okay, Mary Dawn and Kathy are about 27 months apart. Kathy and Marcia are 17 months apart. And Marcia was in kindergarten when Tim was born. So there was about 5 years in there.
Okay. Can you think back to the most challenging part of having 4 little ones at the same time?
Well, their dad was gone a lot. And just taking care of them. And because he wasn't there, I'd had to help him with their homework. And we had one church where we didn't have very much hot water, and I had to put the 3 little girls in the tub together to save on water because it would be cold. In some of the churches, they weren't very cooperative, so to speak, realizing that I had a handful. And we went to our first little church with the 3 children, and they didn't have a nursery in the church. And I remember the first day I was trying to hold Marcia, who was a little over 6 weeks old. Kathy was crawling under the pews, and Mary Dawn was, you know, kind of, she was a toddler. And, you know, here I had three to look after, and this lady sitting behind me, she grabbed Kathy and was taking care of her. And there was another mother in the church who had small children, and I said, it really would be nice if we could have a nursery in this church. And we started the nursery in that little country church with our babies. I don't know how many children she had, but I had the 3. But I think the hardest time, too, in life is when they reached their teenage years. Maybe the latter part of the junior high age, they begin to question your authority. And, you know, well, so-and-so can do this, and why can't I? And, you know, you have to come back with an answer. And sometimes they can be a little sarcastic, and then roll the eyes, you know, roll the eyes.
Timeless. Every generation.
And sometimes I wasn't too keen about the clothes they wore. And there was that, we were looking at some pictures just a little while ago where the skirts were way up here, and a lot of leg there. And that kind of bothered their dad too. And I was not much on makeup because Grandpa did not want lipstick on his face or on his shirt. And so I was very easy on that. I never wore any eye makeup. And I plucked my eyebrows. I still have my own eyebrows. And I still have my own teeth. And I have friends who are younger than I who pencil their eyebrows and who don't have their own teeth. So I figure I've got one good eye, I've got one good ear, and I've got one good knee.
You're ready to go for another 90 years.
So I think maybe I can go for a few more years. But anyway, and then I think when they're in their teenage years, this is when they go out on dates, and you worry about the driver and where they're going to go. I never let the girls date until all of them had driver's license, because I felt that if they knew the rules of the road, that they would know if their companion was breaking the law. If they were driving too fast or doing things they shouldn't have done. I just felt as though they would be safer that way. So I was trying to think, I think especially of your mother, and both of us have allergies too. Your mother has allergies, and we struggled with that, and foods. And Marsha, I said, you'd make a good missionary. I said, you'd even eat monkey meat, where Kathy won't eat baked beans.
Yes, every kid is different, I found.
Yeah, and they had their likes and dislikes, but one thing I found, whatever I set on the table, that was dinner. Mm-hmm. And if you didn't like what was there, that was too bad.
You didn't
you but I think they all managed to. And also, when I grew up, you never left any food on your dish. You cleaned up your plate. And if you didn't, if there was dessert, you didn't get any dessert. Because if you can't eat your meat and potatoes, I'm sure that you can't eat your cake and your cookies or whatever. And so that's how it was in my home growing up, and I carry that over into my children's. And that just to see food scraped off of the plate and put in the garbage, it just bothers me. Mm-hmm. And I think it's better to take smaller portions, and that way, if you need more, then ask for more. But then to pile your dish with food and then only eat half of it is just not wise or conservative. Well, I remember that we had like a Chanel, I don't know what kind of fabric it was. It was a wreath it was red and it had the light, the bulb, Mm-hmm. And we turned that on on Christmas Eve. And Mother said, no, we have invited the spirit of Christmas into our home. And no more arguing, nothing harsh, but let's remember that the Spirit of Christ is in our home. And I remembered that. So Christmas Eve was something very special. Of course, we always had something at the church, Christmas Eve service, the candlelight, which was very beautiful. And came home, and then that's when we had the meal, where everybody wore red, of course. Okay. And I think I probably mentioned that term, I just vaguely remember. But, and at Easter time, I had little notes for each child on Easter. They got up a little early on Easter. Of course, that Sunday, they got to get to church, too, in Sunday school, get them all ready. And they were all going in different directions because, like, say, Kathy, look in underneath Dad's desk. So she would go there, and she'd find another note. And that note would say, go and look behind the couch. And there would be another note. And then the next one would be, go and look inside the bathtub. And that's where she'd find her basket. So they they were really
Absolutely.
busy. They were really busy. It was fun.
We did
They
that too.
enjoyed that. And we usually would color eggs and trying to, but you know, they worked together. Even for Valentine's, they would make their own Valentines. We always would send them to the grandparents. And in May, I remember when we lived in Princeton, I had them make little May baskets. And then I don't think we put dandelions in them, but we put some kind of flowers in them. And then we had older people that lived across the street from us, and they would take them over and put them on their porch for them. That was May Day. And they made, we made our Christmas cookies. Yes, we all worked at that together. And of course, Marcia was always running, trying to keep up with the other two. And when she was just a little tyke, let me see, she was the youngest when we were in Princeton, and she was still learning the different things. And I would say, "What's this, Kathy?" or Marcia, and I would point to it on her ear. And what's this? Your nose. And so then one time I said, "Well, what's this up here?" And she just couldn't answer at all. Kathy looked at her very disgusted, and she said, "It's your thinker, dummy." In other words, you think with that up there. But anyway, they shared the same room in our when we were at Brick Church that was in Wisconsin, and they had twin beds for them, and they had blue bedspreads. And Marcia was very good at hiding her Easter candy and her Christmas candy and any candy she got. And I guess one year she had her eggs with the candy, and for some reason, several weeks after Easter, her room just didn't smell good. I said, "I don't know what you girls have done in this room," but I said, "It just doesn't smell good." And so I kept working around trying to find out why, and I moved the dresser back out of the way, and Marcia had put her eggs back there, and the eggs had begun to spoil. So that was the reason that also we had paper drives that they were connected with at the church. I don't know where the young people collected paper, and then they could take it somewhere and get so much money. And somehow they must have gotten a hold of books like Esquire or something like that. And I guess they were up there in their room looking at those books, and they heard Mother coming up the steps. And they opened the window and put it out on the roof. And I don't know whatever happened to those things, but anyway, they would get into mischief even when they were, junior high and seniors, and each of them at school had lots of friends. Mary Dawn was third runner-up for prom queen. Your mother was one of the candidates for homecoming queen. And when it came to Marcia and one of the fellows in school nominated her, she wouldn't serve. She said, "I don't want to do that." And in the 8th grade, Santa Claus came to the school, and they needed a Christmas princess to assist him. And so they chose Kathy. And since Santa Claus was going to be dressed in his red outfit, I thought, well, Kathy should have a red dress too. So I had a friend who was a good seamstress, and I said, "If I got the pattern and fabric, would you make a dress for Kathy?" And it was red velveteen. And her picture was in the local paper in that outfit. And I think this went through the PTA, and I believe that Kathy had a charm bracelet then, and they gave her a charm. And I don't know if it was a Santa Claus or if it was a Christmas tree or what, but she put that charm on her bracelet. And so I was very proud of her, all the girls' accomplishments. Marcia participated in the Miss Jersey County festival or whatever, or contest, and she was third runner-up for that. And so she has a trophy that she keeps in her china closet. But she had to walk around in a bathing suit, and she had to wear a formal, and she had to be questioned by the judges. And it was, being a pastor's daughter. I said, Marcia, I said, they may ask you questions about what's it like to be a PK. But she did very well, and we were all very proud of her. So I think that all of the children, including Tim, have all done very well in, with the gifts that they have and the families that they're raising to know and love Christ. And, when they're growing up, you think, oh, what will life be like? How will they turn out? But somehow they all turned out pretty good, good citizens. Lovely Christian parents.